Starting off at number 10, the man that started it all for Eli and Peyton, Archie Manning. Now, Archie Manning does not have good numbers. Most of what I'm going to say about Archie Manning is how bad the New Orleans Saints were in the 1970s. But let's start with Archie. Archie was a second overall pick in 1971. He's a two-time Pro Bowler. He passed for over 3,000 yards twice. And that is despite being on maybe the worst team ever for an entire decade. The New Orleans Saints in 1970, under Manning's leadership, won 31 games in the 70s. Those are games that he started. They were 31 and 78, and that's despite winning 15 times in the last 2 years of the decade. So for the first 8 years, they were 16 and 61 in games Archie Manning started. I know that doesn't sound great for Archie, but keep this in mind. The first 5 years of his career, he was sacked an average of 37 times. An average of 37 times a year. That's crazy. So I don't have good numbers for Archie Manning. That's why he's way back here at number 10. But I will say this really cool thing. When I was doing research for this project, I found a website that actually ranked the players from the 70s. Even though there wasn't fantasy football in the 70s, it ranked the players by their position. And Archie Manning in 1972 is a third-ranked quarterback for fantasy points. And then in 1978, he's a fifth-ranked quarterback. So nothing mind-blowing, but again, that's why he's 10th. The 70s were not a great decade for quarterbacks. The league was still heavy on defense and running attacks, and the rules dictated that you ran the ball, and quarterbacks had a real hard time, as you'll see as we go through the list. Number 9, Jim Hart of the St. Louis Cardinals. Jim Hart was a 4-time Pro Bowler. In 1974, he would have ranked 4th as your fantasy quarterback. From 1974 to 1976, the St. Louis Cardinals went 31 and 11, and Jim Hart passed for nearly 8,000 yards, which is great numbers for that decade. He threw 57 touchdowns as opposed to only 40 interceptions. Again, very good for that era. Number 8, none other than Washington Redskins quarterback Billy Kilmer. Billy Kilmer was a 1972 Pro Bowler, and of course he led the Redskins to the Super Bowl that year. They lost to the Miami Dolphins. He led the league in touchdowns that year. In years 71 through 77, the Redskins under Kilmer's leadership was 49 and 22. And he threw 66 touchdowns and 42 interceptions during that time period. Number 7 is Burt Jones. When I was researching this, I was really surprised to see just how great Burt Jones was for about a 3-year period of time. He was actually the 1976 MVP. That shocked me. I couldn't believe it. To me, Burt Jones was just kind of an average journeyman quarterback. His career was winding up while I was just getting interested in football. But from 1975 through 1977, the Colts were 31 and 11. He threw 59 touchdowns, to only 28 interceptions, which is unheard of for that era. A 2-to-1 touchdown interception ratio. And getting into fantasy football again, in 75, he would have been the 3rd-ranked fantasy quarterback. In 76 year, he won MVP. He was the number 1 fantasy quarterback. And then the following year, in 77, he was the number 2 fantasy quarterback. He led the league with 3,100 yards passing in 1976. And like I said, it was a big surprise to me to see how good he was. Moving right along to number 6, Bob Griese, probably the most hated quarterback here in Bills country during the 1970s. In the 1970s, the Miami Dolphins won all 20 games against our beloved Buffalo Bills, 20-0. It was crazy. I'm glad I was too young to remember it. But during that decade, with Bob Griese as quarterback, the Dolphins were 81 and 34. He's a 6-time Pro Bowler, back-to-back Super Bowl victories. There was a 3rd Super Bowl in there that the Dolphins lost, and his stats were surprisingly to me not as good as I thought they would. I thought he'd be higher up on this list than 6, but that's the best I could do for him. I think his numbers would have been better if he didn't have 3 running backs in his backfield, Jim Kick, Larry Zonka, and Mercury Morris. That probably held him back quite a bit. And at number 5, the Snake, Kenny Stabler. Kenny Stabler was the quarterback for the Raiders for almost every game they played in the 1970s. He was the 1974 MVP. He led the league in touchdowns and completion percentage twice. He threw for 20 touchdowns or more 4 times. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler. His numbers aren't super great, but the Raiders were, and he was their leader. That's why I put him 5th. And as a side note, Ken Stabler was the first left-handed quarterback to win the Super Bowl. I wonder if you guys will be as surprised as I am that this person is ranked number 4th. Ken Anderson. I can't believe the numbers he put up. From 73 through 76, the Cincinnati Bengals, who 37-17 for those 4 years, and Ken Anderson threw 76 touchdown passes to only 47 interceptions, which was very good for that era. He was coached early in his career by Bill Walsh. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler, and only once in the 70s did he throw more interceptions than touchdowns. And for you fantasy guys out there, in 1973, he was the 5th rated fantasy quarterback. In 74 and 75, he was number 1. He led the league in passing yards twice. Like I said, I'm surprised to see him up this high, but there he is. And this guy I thought would be higher up the list. Number 3, Terry Bradshaw. I really thought that he was going to be number 2, but I just couldn't do it after reading his numbers. He just threw too many interceptions. His numbers aren't out of this world. What he was clutch. When the Steelers needed a big game from their quarterback, he was there for them. Famously won 4 Super Bowls, 2-time Super Bowl MVP, started almost every game in the 1970s for the Steelers. And for your fantasy players, 4 times he would have been one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the league. Number 2, Fran Tarkenton. I actually did a little bio video on him not too many weeks ago if you want to look back through my little videos and try to find him. But he was surprisingly the 1975 MVP, surprising to me anyway. And despite the fact that 78 was his last year, he's a 4-time Pro Bowler. Again, for you fantasy people, he was a top 5 quarterback 6 times in the 70s. He led the league in passing yards his last season, 1978. And he played in 3 Super Bowls. Unfortunately, he won them all. And probably the number 1 stat that I found for Fran Tarkenton, or maybe it's the number 1 stat, the one that he enjoys the most. He is actually tied for 2nd in richest former quarterbacks. His net worth is $300 million. Despite playing in the 60s and 70s, he obviously had other business ventures after football. And he is tied with Tom Brady for the number 2 richest quarterback in NFL history. And probably no surprise to anybody, number 1, Roger the Dodger, Roger Staubach. The Dallas Cowboys, under his leadership, went 84-29 in the 1970s. They went to the Super Bowl 4 times. They won 2 of them, once against Miami, once against Denver. Roger was Super Bowl 6 MVP, 6-time Pro Bowler. Interestingly enough, he was also drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs way back in 1964. He was the highest rated quarterback 4 times. He threw 152 touchdowns in the 1970s to only 109 interceptions. And he retired after the 1979 season, despite having thrown, I can't talk today, I guess. He threw 27 touchdowns. He retired because he was concerned about all the concussions he was getting. I think he was a little bit ahead of his time in that regards. So for your fantasy players, this guy was the best. He was in the top 5 fantasy-wise 8 different years. 3 times he was number 1. Twice he was number 2. And you're probably wondering who is the richest quarterback in NFL history. And it's this guy. He has a net worth of $600 million, double what Fran Tarkenton and Tom Brady are worth. So there you have it. So that's my take on the top 10 quarterbacks for the 1970s. And I know everybody's wondering, do I have sports cards to give away? I do. And they're quarterbacks from the 70s. I don't have all 10 of those guys, but I have 11 cards that I'm going to give away. But before I talk about that, I got to talk about my daughter. Last night was the final cross-country meet of the season. She ran her best race, came in 4th place overall. I'm so proud of her. I am going away this weekend to the Finger Lakes, probably for the last time this year. I might make a video while I'm there. I'm kind of excited about making a video outside on the porch at the cabin, but we'll see what happens. Maybe, maybe not. And then lastly, I've got these 11 cards. All quarterbacks, all starting quarterbacks from the 1970s. We're going to flip through them real quick, and what you need to do to win them is just say, hey, I want that one. First come, first serve. 1 per person. I guess it's the benefit of being a person that watches my videos and gets notifications and is subscribed. So I've got this 77 Joe Ferguson. Hopefully these are showing up well on the camera. A 77 Joe Theismann. I think this is a 72, Sonny Jurgensen. 74 maybe, Burt Jones. Another 74, I hope that's 74. Archie Manning. I hope I got it right. 74, Ken Anderson. 76, Ken Stabler. I know my 76s. 76, Bob Greasy. 78, Terry Bradshaw. 77, Fran Tarkington. 79, Roger Staubach. Like I said, first come, first serve. Just say, hey, I want this card. What you're going to need to do, though, is tell me that you sent me an email to this address and send me your address so I can mail the card to you. If somebody had already claimed the card beforehand, I will let you know. For those of you I've met that already sent me your addresses because you won previous contests, it might be a good idea to send it again because I've sent so many cards to so many different people that it's getting real hard to keep everybody straight. So, yeah, just recapping. These cards are available for free. Hit me up. Have a good night, everybody. Oh, I always forget one last thing. All right, everybody, take care.